you're willing to moderate the panel for us today.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate everything that you and your organization is doing. Having grown up in a country where apprenticeships is the norm, actually more people come to their careers through apprenticeships than they do through college, where I'm from in Germany. It's nice to see this model starting up here. So on my panel, I'm joined by Jim Chilton, who is has been a CIO at 4 or 5 companies at this point, so a real veteran, and also someone who is on the boards of a number of very interesting startups in the Boston area. And Yvonne DeSalvo, who has been an HR executive in the Bay Area, mostly around tech companies for quite some time. So we've got some two very interesting perspectives here that I think will provide some nice input to people who are considering the concept of apprenticeship. So Jim and Yvonne, welcome.
Thank you.
So let me start with a question that I'm going to throw to both of you. And so, why don't we, Yvonne, why don't you start with you afterwards, just so we don't talk over each other. Why did you even think about apprenticeships, right? You probably all have a hiring model that you're used to, and you've got a whole program in place, and it's, I'm sure, working great. And then all of a sudden, some folks come along and ask you to do something differently. And so, why did you consider this different approach?
So first off, Reiner, thank you very much to you and the Apprenti team for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm excited to be here and excited about talking about this topic. But what intrigued me about the apprentices and the apprenticeship program is how it grows. And for us, it was around the software developer role, but how it grows that community. We all know how hard it is to find talent. And then once you find talent, to keep talent in your organization. And although VMware and a lot of our companies had a lot of strategies that help to attract different groups of individuals, the thing that I found most common is that they all had college degrees, they all had computer science degrees. So I felt like even though we were tapping into returnships or other programs, it was always that same community. We weren't growing the pool. And so when I first met Apprenti, that was the thing that really attracted me to it, was that here is an opportunity to grow that pool. And think outside of the very traditional pathway into tech. And I also thought that there was a great connection into VMware as, we believe in a growth mindset, right? And so, what you started your career for may not be where you end up in your career, and moving through the organization is really important. And so this, applied to apprenticeships is that on steroids. And then finally, there was a real personal connection for me, because I grew up in a household where, my mom had to sort of reinvent herself when she was in her 30s while raising 6 kids. And so it was really sort of instilled in me, your choice in career when you're in your early 20s doesn't have to be your choice in careers, throughout your entire life, and that we all have the capacity to learn and to do different things. So I think it was all those things. There was a lot more I learned through the program, but those are the things that really attracted me to the apprenticeship program in the beginning.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like the two themes here is, one is a new source of talent, right? We all know the people graduating from the computer science programs these days are all kind of look the same. And I point out personally that when I got my computer science degree, there are more women doing computer science than there are today, which is not exactly the trend we'd like to see. And then the second thing is, as you point out, there's a lot of really talented people, really smart people who might just not go through the traditional path. Mm-hmm. So Jim, can I ask the same question for you as well, in terms of why you guys thought about the apprenticeship model? Again, I'm sure you had your standard hiring sources. I'm sure it was all going well, but you decided to take a risk in this area, and just curious what drove you to do that.
Well, thank you, Runner. And it is a interesting question. First of all, you're very persuasive, as is Lauren, so that didn't hurt. But I think why Apprenti, why now? I think Yvonne covered some of these points, but I do think we wanted to find new sources of talent. And we knew, particularly here in Boston, I think, is that, this is a super competitive market, especially competitive from a technology perspective. So finding technologists in Boston is a really hard thing to start with. But there's two dimensions that we cared about at Cengage, was both getting and retaining the technology talent, but also recognizing that it should be a representation of the city for which we are within. In the talent pool that I was seeing as someone who joined Cengage about 3.5 years ago, didn't look at all like the demographic in Boston. And that was a problem for us, because we wanted the company, and we continue to be a company of learners built for learners, right? I mean, we're in the education system. So part of what we do for a living is enable education. And so having a pool of talent of people who are capable, interested, and competent about the skills that they're interested in, we also recognize can't come through this one path through higher education. And so I think, since we fundamentally believe those things, Reiner, it made it easy for me to jump onto the idea of what could we do with apprentices inside of Cengage and leverage the Apprenti program. So I was piqued by the curiosity of the approach. And I think the second part was that we also wanted to have people ready to do the job. We can talk about all the other benefits of the program, but one of the key things is that when the apprentices show up, they're well prepared. These are people who are trained at that point, selected by us, and put in place to help us in the specific needs that we have. So we felt really good about what we were going to get out of the program from that perspective. So I think those two things were some of the key reasons for us, but I think that the primary one was really this new funnel of talent that we were not seeing before, of qualified, willing, and able candidates that we wanted to be part of Cengage.
That's great. And I think that the second to last point, I think, is actually particularly interesting, right? To have, when people think of apprenticeships, most people worry that, hey, I'm getting people who don't know anything yet, and I have to teach them everything. I think what you point out here is that the way this program is structured, not only is there a lot of education up front so that people are pre-trained, but more importantly, that you get input into what that training is. And so as a result, the people have a lot of the training that's very relevant to the kinds of things that you're doing, which I think is in some sense different than a lot of the traditional sources and real positive. Yvonne, whenever you try something new, you're taking some risks, right? Especially if you're out there putting your neck on the line, and within your organization, that's all looking at you a little weird as you try this, suggest this new thing. So how did that go? What kind of risks did you perceive, and how did you manage them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there are, like you said, there's a lot when you do something new. And so, for me, it's sort of, I sort of took it in steps, right? The first thing I needed to find was an executive sponsor, because I knew that this wasn't something that was on the HR roadmap at this point. And so, but even if it were on the HR roadmap, you need headcount, and the headcount comes out of the business, right? And so I needed to find an executive sponsor who was willing to put some budget towards this and take a chance with me, right? On something that was sort of an unproven concept. At least at VMware, it was an unproven concept. But once I had the executive sponsors, then it was sort of the hurdle of getting the mind share of the hiring managers. And because I remember still the first conversation I had with them, they were sort of looking at me like, you want to hire who for what jobs, and how does that happen? Because their careers started in that very traditional, right, 4-year college degree. I get recruited out of college and move right into the path. But again, I reminded them that they were selected specifically from their executive sponsors because they were the best hiring managers in the organization, right? And that they have a reputation for cultivating talent and investing in their talent. And so, kind of take this journey with me and help me learn, help the company learn. And it really is a pilot. It's a learning journey for all of us. And so I've got their mind share around that, and it turned out that some of them are the biggest advocates for this program, and it's just absolutely amazing how everybody just kind of once they start getting exposed, really start sort of leaning in and figuring out ways to help make this happen. And then I'd say that the last risk was big. It was HR in of itself. So I come from the HR organization, and so I was smart enough to know that I wouldn't be able to just sort of throw this onto their priority list in the middle of the year, and so I decided to work with the business unit to bring these individuals on as contractors instead of employees. Because if they come on as employees, then absolutely HR needs to be at the at least in our organ, it has to be at the table, make sure we have the right comp structures and job structures, and the systems can accept these roles and things like that. Are we offering the right benefits? Lots of questions. But if we bring them in as contractors, then it's all laid out in the SOW, right? And it's much more, the business leader has a lot more autonomy at that time. And for me, having that MVP, right, that minimal viable product, it's like this program can scale quite a bit. There's lots of investments we can make. But right now, for me, the first step was I needed to prove that we can teach software developers inside the company, right? We had the right leaders to do that. And so I kept very focused on sort of the first 12 months, let's prove we can teach people. And then once we have that, then the rest of it can come and we can build from there. The second year, do we bring the next cohort in as employees, things like that. So I think keeping it very sort of, what is the one or two things that we really want to prove with the first concept was really helpful. And that kind of kept me personally off the ledge sometimes, because you do feel like you're on an island by yourself occasionally. So.
I mean, it's great, particularly I think the comment that you made that most people who are initially quite skeptical, once they experience the program, have become advocates. And we've seen that across the board with our employers. It's certainly, I can't speak for the entire national market because I'm not entirely familiar with it, but I know in the Boston market where we have quite a few employee partners, they've all come back for seconds, so to speak, and thirds. We haven't lost a single employer yet, which is great. Well, Jim, let me ask you the same kind of somewhat similar question, right? One of the things, people have a certain way of hiring, particularly the line executives, such as yourselves, and now you're asking everyone to do things differently. Not only your management team who's they're hiring, the HR team, right? Because this year it came in through a different direction, the legal team, and the thing that people hate the most of anything in life is to change their way they do their work, right? People are creatures of habit, and people hate changing their habits. So you had to get people to change.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
How do you approach that?
It's exactly the opposite side of what Yvonne was describing, is that, change is hard, and change that is in place for decades. And I think what's described is how you recruit and get people in this country has been the same way for decades. And so when you're going up against something like that, yes, change is really difficult in that case. And I think for me and my team, it was really around actually HR and for legal, about how do you convince people that this is a new way to get talent. And again, leveraging in the understanding of what's happening in Europe, that this actually exists in the world, that this is a way to do this. And that there's these capable, talented people who we haven't found any other way, that are on the doorstep to participate with us, but we have to find and get them in the company in a different way. And so it did take a lot of persuasion and getting through that internal red tape and the obligatory stamps and forms that have to be filled out. I can say now, as someone who has 8 apprentices, 2 that have converted into employees and plan on 6 more or more next year, it's worth every ounce of effort that I put into it. But it does take effort. You have to put some effort. You have to believe in what you were doing. And I do, and I did. And I think that helps. So yes, I had to send out a couple of emails. I had to have a couple of meetings to make sure this carried its way through the process, particularly for those first 2 that we wanted to get in the door. Once in the door, the people that were involved that I was so struggling to persuade before became the single biggest advocates for the program. These are people who believed and saw the other side of this in a way that only became real after you tried it. So I would say to the people that are considering it is that you have to get through it and you have to believe it enough, but there is enormous dividends on the other side of this. And I do think that, again, it's easy for me to say now, is that we've had incredible success when I look at the diversity of the people that we brought in from the very first 2 to the most current 2. And we've always bring them in pairs so that they have someone to work with. And yeah, I think the only other thing is inside the company, Reiner, is that there is this, you have to believe that you want to grow talent from within. You have to believe that getting people in through the apprentice program, and I think you've said this before, Lauren certainly has, is that people say it's too good to be true. And it is. And I think when they hear that and you see this, is that the candidates we talked about before, coming in qualified, ready, willing, and able, but appreciative. These are employees that are joining you and are appreciative of the opportunity for which you've engaged in together. And that doesn't happen every other day. And that doesn't happen any other way, at least certainly not the way I've experienced. So I think it is a paradigm shift, but I think once you break through it, it's remarkably beneficial to the company and to all of those involved.
It's great. Maybe if I pull out 2 things here, I think one is that the attitude of the employees that you get here is so different. I think most of us have experienced this, particularly with the kind of the recent graduating classes, of the last 5, 6, 7 years. When they come in and work for our companies, their attitude tends to be, yeah, you are so lucky to have me. And if you don't keep me happy, I'm out of here. And I think that these employees are quite different in the sense that they are so grateful that you are having them and that you're giving them this opportunity. I've seen that certainly. The number of apprentices I've talked to have talked to me, hey, you've changed not only my life, but that of my family by providing this opportunity that otherwise was not available, right? I've got the talent for it, but I couldn't get at it is quite impactful.
Yeah, I think that last point, Reiner, just to build off that, is that how often do you really get the opportunity to help somebody change the trajectory of their life? How often do you get to do that, really? And to think that you're part of that, even a small part of that, I don't know how anybody couldn't want to do more of that.
Especially while they're also doing great work for you. So it's like
Exactly.
which actually gets me to the next question I want to ask both you guys, and I'll start with Yvonne maybe, is how have the apprentices done so far? In terms of the performance you're seeing. I know Jim is a couple rounds into this, so it may have more track record, but Yvonne, why don't you start and hand it over to Jim.
Yeah, so we've seen some great success. So we had during this last year, we acquired Carbon Black, and so they came in with an apprentice program that they converted to hires. And then in the cohort the first cohort pilot that we've set up, we're in the process of doing those conversions now. And so we're kind of settling in on roles and groups and things of that sort. So I don't want to overshare there, but the contributions that they have made, the diversity of thought that they've brought into the teams, the sort of the hunger that they have to learn, and you just, absorb, and their capacity to absorb over this last year has really surpassed, I think, the expectations of the managers. And so it's, again, as we continue down this path, as month after month kind of went along, they became more and more advocates for this. And they would start coming forward, Jim, to your point about like, and I have this idea, and how about we do this instead? Or, and so that's been really amazing to see. We did learn that there was one particular group that was probably not the right fit for a variety of reasons. It was a group that had to that worked on like the entire stack, and there had to be a lot of institutional product knowledge. And so in hindsight, we've learned that focusing on teams that have sort of more focused remits and things, or product size versus depth of an entire, integrated stack of solutions is probably a better fit. But that wasn't because of the individual. Once we move the individual to another team, they've been just a star. So
that's great. Yeah, we're hearing that across the board. So Jim, maybe just for you, in terms of how have they performed just as employees, in terms of just executing on the jobs that you've assigned them to?
They've done great. And like I said, we've got 8, 2 have converted into permanent employees. It's interesting, Ronnie, the last 2 we got in the mid of COVID, and I was nervous about that. I was nervous about, this is hard enough for the managers and even harder for the apprentices to come into an environment, and yet they've been remarkably successful as well. And so I think it's a testament to the program is that their readiness and willingness to be able to do this is demonstrated in how they attack the jobs and opportunities that we've given them, right? So you do see that interest, that commitment, and you don't see that every day, unfortunately, but you certainly see that. I've seen it with every single one of the apprentices. So like I said, I'm thrilled with the program. I'm thrilled with the 8 folks that we brought in. We brought in software developers, IT business analysts, and cybersecurity analysts. So we've sprinkled across kind of my organization. And the other thing that's been really great to watch is the managers of these folks and the people around them, right? This community kind of embraces the idea that you're bringing people in and helping developing a path about how people can ladder up in the company, how they can continue to develop and evolve from where they are. And so I think that has helped support them and make them feel like they are part of something special, and not just, so often you see companies make the mistake with intern programs where they're like, well, yeah, the 2 interns are in the closet doing some work, or the interns are buried over in the staircase. No, this is people that are part of the department. They're part of the group, and they're part of the growth for the company. And so I think it's been a great opportunity, I think, for the apprentices, but also for me and my team about developing the leadership of the group. So the vice presidents, the directors, the people that report into my organization, recognizing this is part of their job too. This isn't just an idea. This is something that we should make a permanent part of our fabric and how you develop organizations. And so I think it's gone really well for us. I think we have a culture at Cengage that embraces this. We know about learning. We know about teaching. It's what we do for a living. And we know that there's only a few things you can't teach: character, will, and some of these things are some of those things you cannot teach. And so we believe that if you bring in these super talented people who have all this upside potential, we can teach them a ton more. And so I think, like I said, it's different for Cengage because it's the core of what we do. But I do believe that the Zoom world and all of this for Cengage and how we behave and act, it's allowed this to be really successful for us because we don't have a Zoom session inside of Cengage where everybody's not on their video. There are no black screens at all. Everybody's on all the time, and you're part of that all the time. And so I think the culture and who we are and what we believe, I think has enabled and contributed to how this program could be successful with us. But I think it could be successful anywhere. I really do.
No, that's great. And actually, maybe just 2 points to highlight. One is, some people, when they initially get introduced to apprenticeships, they think it's an internship. And as you point out, it has nothing to do with internship. Internship is someone's in for a few months, and then they go back to whatever they were doing before, and they're really just a temporary person in the team. That's why they often end up in the closet, as you said. These folks here are permanent employees. They are just from a different source and a different source of talent that you'd otherwise not have the privilege of having access to. So I think it's one point to be made. And I think the second point that I'd like to make is the last thing you were talking about, which is the importance of training and that being part of the day-to-day job. And to me also, it's kind of like there's a lot of paychecks we get. One is called the emotional paycheck. And whenever you can make a difference in someone's lives, in their life, and do something good for the company at the same time, that's one of those good emotional paychecks you can get on the job. So let me, in the few minutes I have before we go to Q&A, let me just end with a question, again, same question to each of you, but from slightly different perspective. Yvonne, kind of, if you're an HR executive out there, you're thinking about adding this to the mix in terms of the hiring sources, what advice would you give to an HR executive who's thinking that through? And then Jim, I'm going to ask you the same question from a line executive perspective.
Yeah, I think for me, it would be take a chance, right? It's like, imagine what the worst case scenario is we come out with some learnings from this, right? We learn about ourselves as leaders. We learn about the organization and things like that. And then also, as I mentioned before, what's the minimal viable product that you can start with? I think it's been my experience that when we think about these things from an HR perspective or from a business operations perspective, it's like we have to get every T crossed, every I figured out. What's the compensation? What's this? What's the benefit structure in this? And think creatively about, well, we don't need to figure those things out if we bring someone in, as I said, like as a contractor, or we don't need to think about year 2 yet, right? Or we actually don't even need to think about this, next 6 months. Let's worry about the first 6 months, and slowly take it on as a bite-sized pieces, and just sort of get through the next quarter, and then sort of get, versus like imagining the entire picture. And then the other thing that has occurred for us, and you'll hear a little bit more about this when you hear from Maritza in a little while, is that we've been able to sort of take that foundation and actually build other non-traditional hiring pathways. And so it's been a great sort of building block for us to say, well, if this worked, then how about this, or this particular program, or this returnship, and things like that. And so it really does open up the mind to the organization and the leaderships about other opportunities that we can pursue. And it didn't always have to be in that very traditional way we started building tech 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I like your point of like it not only adds this pathway, but just different ways of thinking about pathways in general. So Jim, let me, before we go to the Q&A, let me ask you the same question. Any advice you'd give to a technical executive who is thinking of bringing apprentices in their organization?
Yeah, I think Yvonne covered it, but I do think, Reiner, it's a no-brainer. There is no downside here. And as you pointed out, there's an emotional paycheck component to this as one dimension alone. That is, look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, when's the last time you changed somebody's life for the better? You've got an opportunity to do that. And if you don't take that opportunity, you got to ask yourself why. So park that one for a second. From a CIO, CTO technology perspective, we are always trying to find talent. Gosh, we spend a ton of our time just trying to build up the funnel, to find the people, to retain the people. This has proven to be a great mechanism to find people, have them properly trained and ready for us, and then the retention, their commitment to us and our commitment to them is that you're joined straight away when you select each other through this program. And so the level of retention, I think, is going to be very high with the people that come through this program with us. And I think the other part is that, excuse me, if it matters to you about the pool of people that you have in your team, and it does to me, and it did to me in Cengage before it was trending, and you want your company to look a bit like your community, then this is an important part of what you should use as a recruiting pool, because it is the only pool of talent I've seen in the last decade that actually looks like the community for which the company rests in, and doesn't look like everything else that has the standard path of travel that gets people to your doorstep. This is for the people that don't have the network, don't have the connections, didn't go to the right school, or maybe didn't even finish school. And so I think for that, I encourage you to consider it. I think the other part is that having people that show up ready to do the job that you need and willing, to your point, Reiner, doesn't happen every day. This program enables that. So I would encourage people to consider it. And yes, I would say to everyone is that if you're introducing this in your company like I did, you will have to write a couple of emails. You will have to help this process through, particularly the first time. In my experience, once you've done it the first time, it will go fine the second, third, and fourth time. But take the initiative to do it. It will pay you dividends in return that I think you will appreciate. And I think for me, the final point on this one is that, we know that talent has got that equal distribution. It's a matter of finding those people. And this is that opportunity to bring in the people that appreciate that opportunity, that their talent can be recognized through this program that otherwise may be hidden.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. There's a lot of really, really smart, hardworking, dedicated people who just for whatever circumstance of life didn't get the same opportunities in terms of college that other people did. That doesn't make it any less talented, any less smart, any less capable, any less hardworking. So, Lauren, with that, let me hand over the floor to you to lead us through a Q&A session here.
Great, thank you, Reiner, Yvonne, and Jim. That was really, really appreciated the conversation. I think our attendees hopefully did, just based on the chat. We do have time for a couple of questions. So if you haven't submitted a question that you'd like to address to any of the panelists, please do in the Q&A feature that's at the bottom panel of your Zoom window. Our first question, I think, is probably best answered for both Yvonne and Jim. The question we have is, did you find it harder to find an executive sponsor, hiring managers that were willing to incorporate apprentices, or navigating the operational side of HR, or all three? So I think that's probably best for both of you guys to share your perspective on that.
Yvonne, I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Jim. So that's an interesting question. I think, so I was very fortunate in that the client leaders that I was supporting were very much like Jim, just recognize there's a problem, there has to be a different way to do this, and willing to take that risk and put some budget towards this. So I would say that I had an easier pathway there. And once I had that, we were able to sort of voluntold, in order to get some of the hiring managers. So I almost hate to say this out loud, but it was sort of the HR, the legal, the sourcing, the billing, it's the back office sort of pieces that were a bit harder to get through. And the good news, I never really got a no, but I did get a lot of questions like, why this vendor? We have a contractor vendor that we use. Why are you bringing in a new vendor? Why are you, it's like, it looks like you're hiring employees. Is this really an employee or is this a contractor? And on and on and on. And so, they were doing their job. So that's goodness, because, they need to protect us. But it was sort of, that was sort of the pathway that was, I think, a little bit more challenging to get through.
Yeah, I would I would share that as a sentiment as well. I think that for me, it was tough in both areas. I mean, Cengage is a global ed and tech company, for those of you that don't know. And so we've been a publisher for 150 years, and every major higher education institution in this country uses our course materials to develop higher ed programs. So we are immersed in this. And so I had that challenge as well, which is kind of our very model is to provide capabilities for higher education so people can follow that traditional path that we're talking about. And so the executives were remarkably open to this from the get-go. There was no confusion in our company at all about that. I think as Yvonne talks about, my bigger challenge was actually on the HR and legal side, which was how do you navigate this? And I think they all had best intentions, as everybody does, that they have a process they have to follow. And this is a deviation to that process. And so it does take some encouragement and understanding and explanation and time to make sure that you've gone through it. I think the other dimension in there, and the part that took me a while to figure out, was, so you covered the top and you got the executives on board and you explained the story and why this makes sense. And then you've gone through all the red tape of how do you get this through HR and legal and make it something that you can do. The part in the middle that I think I would encourage is that is the value that's brought to the people that are the hiring managers, the people that are working, the people that are actually see this as a path so that it is something you can share inside the company in other ways. So how can we bring in other software developers in other parts of the group, not just in our group? So make this process a permanent part of what you're doing, rather than this is an exception we're doing for Jim and his team. And to, I feel like for me, it took a little extra effort to make this a permanent part of our future, making it an exception for me and my team, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that, both of you. We have a few more questions that have come through, and I'm just mindful that we probably only have time to answer one more, but we'll make sure that we respond offline to the other questions that come through because we really appreciate the engagement. I think it kind of builds off of one of the last points that both are speaking on, but the feedback you've gotten from the managers, the supervisors, and the experience overall. You talk about that emotional payoff. I think Reiner used that term. Can you just speak to the impact of and the feedback that we've gotten from these managers, mentors, and supervisors, and what other kinds of impacts you've seen within your organization through your partnership with Apprenti and apprenticeships?
Go ahead, Jim. Why don't you start this one?
Oh, okay. Ladies first. You got me flat-footed there. So I think the feedback from the apprentices, of course, has been great. I shouldn't say of course, but has been great. I think the supervisors and the managers has been really good. I think where they struggle was they had to have some responsibility. And again, this is more about the COVID part than it is about pre-COVID. When people were in the office, I think it was easier to do the check-in, to be like, hey, they may not know how we do this or how we do that, particularly around software development, where there's quirky parts of how that world works. And so explaining and helping some of the managers navigate that so that they knew that this was part of their responsibility too. This was not something that rested entirely on the shoulders of the apprentices. But yeah, that's been my experience so far. Every one of the surveys that we've done inside for my team, both for the apprentices and for the supervisors of the apprentices, has been very positive. We've had no negative issues at all.
Yeah, I would agree. It's generally speaking, we've had some positive feedback. I think from the mentors, it really did allow them to get into a much more teaching mode than they would have perhaps in the past, right? We certainly have buddy systems for hiring and things like that, but it's usually more peer based. And so this really puts them in a position where they get to sort of teach, share their knowledge. And I think that and we particularly suggested that they find mentors who may want to move into the management track too, because then this will help them sort of learn that skill of being successful through other people, which is, you know, a pivot that people need to make. And I think that that was really helpful. And then, you know, as I mentioned before, with the managers themselves, you know, they just, I was so surprised on how much they got into it, and it became sort of their not problem to solve, but their sort of opportunity for their organization. And I thought about this, and what if I hold this class for all of them? And it was, you know, it became really their goal, which in the beginning it was the GM's goal. Like, I want to try this, and you've been selected because you're one of my best managers. And, you know, shortly after the apprentices came into the session or into VMware, they were like really into it, like just wanting to make this successful for the individual as well as for the company. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight and your experience on that. Again, a virtual round of applause for Reiner in facilitating this conversation. Yvonne, Jim, for taking the time. Thank you very much. I think it was really helpful to kick off our first session with hearing that direct experience and perspective from both the HR as well as CIO perspective. For questions,